points at 76.94. The pound buys $1.21 and €1.13. LBC weather, rain moving eastwards across the UK tonight. Scattered showers for Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. Windy with blustery showers in western areas tomorrow. Drier in the east and highs of 10 Celsius. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello and welcome to Cross Question. I've just lost all credibility with my panel for admitting that my copy of Spare arrived this afternoon. So we might have a feisty one tonight. We have with us Vicky, Conservative MP for Chelmsford and former Foreign Office Minister. Sam Tarry is Labour MP for Ilford South and a former Shadow Transport Minister. Lionel Shriver, to my right, is a columnist for The Spectator and best-selling author. And Sam Freedman is a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government and former advisor at the Department for Education. Lots to talk about tonight. Lots of questions you might want to ask on subjects like these new anti-strike laws, the war in Ukraine, Prince Harry's book apparently breaking all sales records according to the publishers. Obviously, publishers always tell the truth. Electric cars, we're going to be talking about them after 9, but you might want to ask a question as to why manufacturers are producing fewer of them at the moment. And Grant Shapps has airbrushed Boris Johnson out of a spaceport photo. I don't know how you can ask a question on that, but I'm sure you'll come up with a way. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text 84850. Use Alexa, just say send a comment to LBC. And you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Windsor from London informs us that he'd rather cut out my own eyes than listen or read Prince Harry's book. Well, thanks for sharing that. Right, first question from Ben in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Iain, and Happy New Year to yourself and panel.
Thank you very much. Same to you.
My question is, the anti-trade union legislation that's gone through Parliament at the moment, do the panel think it's undemocratic?
Why do you think it would be undemocratic?
Well, it would have a human rights issue as well, and that's possibly what the unions will use in the courts. So it's
but if it's passed through Parliament, surely that gives it democratic legitimacy?
Well, there's different opinions on that, and the Labour Party have promised to get rid of the legislation when they take power.
Well,
so
indeed.
It's I think it's undemocratic and against human rights, and that's exactly what I would like the panel to give an opinion on.
Right, Sam Tarry, let's start with you, because you were a trade union official before you became an MP. I think that's when we first talked, was it with the FBU?
Yeah.
Looking at what they're proposing, why is it controversial to ask for minimum service levels when that is the case in many other European countries? Why is that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Grant Shapps is quoting that today. We don't meet the vast majority of ILO convention agreements. So actually we're kind of out of step because we have weaker rights at work than the vast majority of other European countries. For me, it just smacks of absolute desperation. It feels that we're headed back to almost a toll puddle martyrs situation. You know, one of the reasons we've got such a bad state of affairs is that not that minimum services are not running because of strikes. You take Avanti West Coast, there's not a decent rail service on that railway most of the year round. You know, look at our hospitals.
I can confirm this allegation.
Nurses, you know, and doctors. You know, one of my brother-in-law's father waited 23 hours in accident emergency spot having chest pains recently. I mean, everyone has stories of just how bad our public and some of our private services, where the government has an impact, are at the moment. This, for me, is absolutely about creating a bogeyman for the government to attack, because they're floundering around. Their economic strategy is a total disaster, and actually they love the fact that they can, you know, blame the trade unions for actually the failures they've got. Quite clearly, you know, nurses do not make an easy decision to go on strike. My sister's a nurse. You know, it's a very difficult decision. She's someone who does palliative care, cares deeply about the patients at the end of their life. These are not people who are wanting to lose several days' wages.
There are going to be minimum service levels. There will still be A&E service, for example, whereas in the ambulance dispute, they're not providing any level of cover, as I understand it.
actually a lot of ambulance sort of paramedics have actually gone off the picket lines often to go and help people. I think that was the same with nurses. The problem here is about the direction of travel. You know, when I was a trade union officer and since being an MP, there have been a number of pieces of legislation brought forward, not just attacking the right to protest, but also attacking rights at work. You know, these are rights that have been built up in this country over nearly 200 years. You know, and from my point of view, and I said this to contracts in pretty stark terms today, this is extremely troubling. It's well out of step. You know, Joe Biden would be condemning this sort of stuff, and he's a US president. You know, they're totally unnecessary. The government could end the vast majority of strikes, and your listeners will know this as well. We've been in the rail sector, the impending ones for junior doctors, the impending ones in the teaching sector. Not by giving in, but by actually negotiating. You know, and what I get sick of is the pact of lies that come out of government ministers' mouths about some of this. They deliberately broke down the talks on the weekend by not offering anything.
Well, we might have a question on the wider,
and also done the same on rail. These things could be solved in days. You don't need new legislation to do that.
Lionel Shriver.
I wouldn't call it undemocratic. I think this is a democratically elected parliament that has a duty to the larger country to provide certain services, and primitive services at that, which involve endangering people's lives. Obviously, you have to balance competing rights, as usual, but I think the least the government is obliged to do is to provide those minimum services. And if that means some sacrifice on the right to strike, I think it's worth.
How do you define a minimum service? Because, I mean, for example, you could say, well, running one train an hour between London and Manchester is the bare minimum, or running.
In fact, it seems that a lot of people are saying that.
Okay, I picked a bad example there, but I mean, it's very subjective as to what minimum service actually means. Same in the NHS. I mean, we would all have our different definitions of that, wouldn't we?
Of course, but we're talking about the principle and not, where to put that point. That's something that legislation has to be determined. But the question was really about whether or not the entire proposition was a moral compromise too far with democratic rights.
Because, Sam, at one end of the scale, you've got the right to strike for everybody, but not everybody has the right to strike now. Police officers can't go and strike. Prison officers can't go and strike. One or two others as well. So it's up to Parliament to decide where to strike that balance, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely democratic for Parliament to decide to do this. I think it's a total red herring. I don't think it deals with the issue at all, which is that public sector pay has fallen well out of line with private sector pay, and we don't have enough people who want to work in the public sector. So the government could ban strikes completely, but it wouldn't deal with the issue. We still have 50,000 nurse vacancies. We still have 165,000 social care vacancies. We'd still have the worst year on record for teacher recruitment. So the issue is not whether there's going to be strikes or not. The issue is whether we have enough people to run the public services that we need. That's the actual minimum service level we need to be talking about. But we're talking about this instead, which is the point of doing it, I guess.
So you think this is basically a dead cat? It's a distraction strategy?
I mean, yes, basically. I think the government has a real political problem here, which is they want to control public spending, which is a completely valid aim. But we also don't have enough people who want to work in key public sector jobs. It's a horrible problem to deal with. I get that, but they're in power and they have to deal with it, rather than this law is designed to create a dividing line with Labour, get Labour to vote against it. It doesn't begin to deal with the actual
Labour have already said that they will repeal it,
which is what they want
into power.
I think it's worth saying that it is totally unworkable. Take the railways, okay? It's better to have a full strike on a full day and that happen than have this minimum service idea. Rolling stock, okay? It will be left all over the country.
It wouldn't be.
No, because it will actually create the days after that happening will be worse. So what you will have is a minimum strike day, maybe another minimum strike day, and then after that, a series of severely disrupted days. Whereas actually I got a train the other day, the day after the strikes, and they pretty much ran fairly smoothly for the journey that I was doing, because the trains, the rolling stock, will be all over the country in absolutely the wrong places. So it just doesn't even work on a practical, logical basis.
Vicky Ford.
So it is, as you said, Lionel, balancing the right to strike with the right to the public to have public services that keep them safe. There's many, many other countries that are our peers that have minimum service levels in law. And that is what this is intended to do, is to keep the public safe during the periods, but also have the right to strike. The actual definition of what will be the minimum services will obviously be dependent on consultation, and so that will have a
But is it
detailed
right for the
process.
Secretary of State to be able to make that final decision?
So it is absolutely right that you have to make sure that you are protecting the public and keeping them safe as well. They, as taxpayers, have paid for these services. They need to be able to access services that keep them safe. In terms of the NHS, my heart goes out to the NHS workers. I'm married to an NHS doctor. I come from an NHS family myself.
Well, I'd like to hear those conversations at home.
There are actually more doctors and nurses working in the NHS than ever before. Yes, there are big vacancies, but there are more doctors and nurses working there. So we need to have that right to strike. It is important, but we also need to have the protection of crucial public services.
Your colleague Stephen McPartland tweeted today, shameful to target individual workers and order them to walk past their mates on picket lines or be sacked. By all means, find the unions, make them agree to minimum service levels, but don't sack individual NHS staff, teachers and workers. Now, OK, that's one tweet from one Conservative MP, but I mean, it strikes me as though there are quite a few of your colleagues who aren't very happy with this.
And nobody wants to sack anyone. We absolutely value those different
but
members
there's a clause in this bill which would allow that to happen.
But that is because you've got to guarantee that you have the minimum level of safety, OK? So, there'll obviously need to be a consultation, as I said, about what are the minimum levels. But it's heart-wrenching to my constituents, some of whom who've waited for a long time for a hospital procedure, partly because of the pandemic and the sort of long COVID that's gone on in the NHS, the impact of the pandemic, to then find that procedures that they may have wanted to have and waited for a long time, which they consider urgent, are being delayed or could be delayed. Actually, in Essex, we haven't seen the nurses going on strike. But it is really important that there can be that consultation, that you can work out what are the crucial public services, and then say to those who are working in those crucial public services, you as an individual need to be there, but we respect that your other colleagues who are working on less crucial services could go on strike. And it's getting that balance. As I said, there are many, many other countries who have this. It is workable, so let's look at doing what is best practice in other countries and deliver it.
What about Sam's point that this is just a distraction strategy? I mean, we're talking about this now. It's the first question from Ben. We could be talking about the rights and wrongs of one of the disputes, I suppose.
It's worth saying as well, excess deaths, at the highest point now in this country since the high point of COVID. That's because we've got a minimum service government, minimum service NHS every day of the week, and that is the real problem here.
Because you've got the hangover of a massive global pandemic that has meant that you've got, especially people with multiple factors that are now affecting their sickness because they've had to wait through the pandemic for other treatments, etc. So you've got lots and lots of pressure. You've got the worst flu season that we've had for many years, coupled with the pandemic. There's lots and lots of issues.
It's worse than any other European. Our excess death figure is worse than any other European country. There has to be a reason for that.
So we absolutely need to address the issue of waiting lists in the NHS. It's why that's one of the Prime Minister's top priorities, and we need to make sure that we get those services delivered, whilst also having conversations, as have happened this week with many of the trade unions, which have been described as constructive, to try and find the solution to keeping the public sector funded in a way that also is affordable to the taxpayer and to the economy. It's a really, really difficult balance at a time when you've also got those sort of global economic pressures, etc.
Ben, thank you very much for that. We'll move on to another subject in just a moment. You're listening to LBC. You're watching, hopefully, Cross Question. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
How many
Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Now, we have not one, but two debutantes on the programme tonight. I thought Vicky Ford had been on the programme before, but she assures me that she hasn't. She's Conservative MP for Chelmsford. Sam Tarry is Labour MP for Ilford South. Lionel Shriver, columnist for The Spectator and author. And Sam Freedman, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government and former advisor at the Department for Education. Now, we've been talking about Ukraine for the last hour of the programme, but Alfie in Wolverhampton wants to talk about that as well. Alfie, what's your question, please? Hi.
Evening. My question is, do you think the panel, the war is going to be advanced in favour of the Ukrainians if we send the Challenger 2s and Warrior armoured fighting vehicles out?
Now, Vicky Ford, we were chatting in the break there, and you pointed out that you're wearing Ukrainian colours and actually do so every day. And just hold your hands up to the camera, because you've got blue and yellow nail paint. Is that nail varnish?
I've had blue. The little ones are yellow, the big ones are blue. I just think we have to keep remembering the people of Ukraine. You know, this is Russia's war in Ukraine, but it's also a global fight for democracy. Okay, if the Ukrainians lose this battle, they lose the battle for freedom, for democracy, for rule of law, for the right to defend your own sovereign territory. And the people of Ukraine are being so brave in fighting this war, and they're fighting it on behalf of those of us who believe in democracy around the world. So every morning I get up, and I've got a lot of blue in my wardrobe anyway. I started wearing yellow as well. And it just reminds me every day of those brave mothers of Ukraine and those fighters who are putting their lives on the line for us. And I think that in order to support them and to support democracy, we need to listen to them about what they need. And when they are saying these are the weapons that we need in order to be able to defend ourselves, defend our freedom, then we as the West are very proud.
How far do we go, though? Because if President Zelensky rings up Rishi Sunak tomorrow and says, thanks for the tanks, I'd quite like 10,000 boots on the ground from countries all around Europe. Will you provide 1,000 from the British Army?
So it's been very important since the beginning that NATO ourselves don't engage in this war. This is not a war between NATO and Russia.
We are by providing military hardware.
We are providing the Ukrainians with not only hardware but also training. That's been absolutely vital, the training that we've given them in order to defend themselves. But crossing that red line of us actually engaging our own troops would be seen as an aggressive factor.
And sending tanks isn't.
As I said, we've been from the very beginning been very clear that we will support them with the weapons and the ammunition. But
in the early months of this war, it would have been inconceivable for us to send tanks. But we are doing now. Now, I think rightly so, but there hasn't been total consistency in the reaction to this.
Yeah, so as I said, the Ukrainian troops have been better and better trained since the very beginning. They've been very careful to make sure that this is them defending themselves, and we need to make sure that we support that. Okay, this is Russia's war.
Sam Freedman.
So to answer the technical question, it's not clear that our tanks will be much use because we're the only people who use them apart from a man. And we don't have very many of them, so we can't send very many. So it might not be a very good idea for them to use our tanks, which they'd have to get trained in and wouldn't have very many of. Really, that we need to get them Leopard 2
We haven't got very many ourselves.
Exactly, we've only got 150, whereas the Leopard 2 tanks, which a lot of European countries use, are probably the thing they actually need and are starting to get from some European countries. But I think we should be supporting the effort to make that happen. I completely agree that you can't. It would be impossible for NATO and Western countries to now walk away from Ukraine after everything that's happened to this point in terms of the message it would send to Russia and other undemocratic states around the world. So we have to keep the support going. The question is technically what's actually going to help the Ukrainians to get that next breakthrough on the front line against Russia.
Lionel Shriver?
I'm afraid that we have the capacity to keep this going. As we keep feeding the Ukrainians more and more weapons, the war will continue. My concern is really with the end game, and actually my My new column in the Spectator is about this. This is getting to be a bad habit. Oh, I wrote a column about that. I worry that we're guilty of a little bit of wishful thinking about that endgame. That is, I find it inconceivable that we're going to bring this to a conclusion and Ukraine gets all its territory back, including Crimea, which is what they want now and what the West that's rhetorically servicing as a goal. And then Putin is simply deposed or he slinks off and says he's sorry. I don't see that happening. For Putin, this is existential, that he cannot admit defeat. And unless it's going to escalate further, in which case it could involve NATO, we're going to end up probably with a pretty dirty, crummy, morally compromised conclusion to this war. And I say this most regretfully. I don't want to see Putin gain in any way from this aggression and from all the horror show war crimes he's committed. But I bet, and I want to be wrong, but I bet that we're going to end up having to give him something.
But who is we here? Because in the end, it's Zelensky that will make the decision as to whether there needs to be talks or, I don't know, some sort of negotiation.
Russia haven't indicated any interest that they want to have talks. Like, I mean, it have to have two parties in talks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Macron tried to bring that about, didn't he, at the beginning of this?
We can say we would like there to be a negotiated settlement, but there's no mechanism to bring about a negotiated settlement. All we can do is try and get Ukraine into as strong a position as possible.
Sam Tarry.
I've not at any point been against supplying weapons and meeting most of the demands that the Ukrainians have asked for. I think that has been the right thing to do. I am nervous that where does this lead to? I think Lionel raised a really good point. You know, I'm a scholar of Russian history and Russian politics the last couple of 100 years, and it would be really foolish of us to underestimate the depth of strength and how not just Putin himself, but the upper echelons of Russian society would essentially need to collapse for Putin to be defeated. And what I'm worried about is how far does this escalate? And I think that is a huge decision. I think it's right that we continue to debate that in Parliament. There's not necessarily, by the way, a right or wrong answer on this, but I think it would be remiss of us not to be thinking about that end game. There will, at some point, have to be a negotiated settlement. If we are in a situation where we're in a hot war with NATO troops on the ground, then I would be extremely concerned about that. And I think that, the generals that are running NATO would also be extremely concerned about that, because when you back someone like Putin into a corner, we really think that he wouldn't use nuclear weapons, even tactically, in that Baltic region. And so I do think, as Sam's pointed out, is this a bit of a gesture in terms of, sort of support? Because actually it's not really what they want. It is those German Leopard tanks. I'm nervous about gesture politics when the stakes are so high.
Mehmet has sent a text in saying, I bet you don't read this out, Ian. Do they remember and wear colours of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Iran, Yemen, Palestine people? That's aimed at you, Vicky.
I never thought we'd see war in Europe in our lifetime.
Why is it different? Because it's in Europe.
So it's it is in our continent, and it is a complete fight against democracy. I just feel it is such a flagrant breach of freedom, of the rule of law. It is such a big country taking on its little tiny neighbour that is fighting. We are fighting for democracy, and I think they are incredibly brave. And maybe I should have stood up earlier for other countries that had been involved in some of these awful situations. But we must stand side by side with our European neighbour. Otherwise, we will see other countries facing the threat from Russia next. I mean, I was the Foreign Office Minister who had to stand at the dispatch box, and I was very proud to stand at the dispatch box and introduce the legislation to fast-track Sweden and Finland into NATO. Sweden and Finland, who had always said they would never join. And now, because they see this as such a direct threat against them, That's why they want to be there. This is in our backyard, and we must stand with them.
Right, let's see if we can squeeze in a question before the 8:30 news. It's a text question from Zach in Watford. Do you believe that the continuous bombardment of media attention on Prince Harry prior to the release of his book has contributed to the record sales? And if so, has this all been a cleverly orchestrated marketing stunt? How cynical we are, aren't we? 400,000 copies, apparently, according to the publishers, this book has sold so far. But when you look at the viewing figures for the Tom Bradby interview on ITV on Sunday night, it was beaten by Happy Valley. Sam?
I cannot express how unbelievably bored I am with this story. I just wish I would actually pay money at this point to never have to hear any of their names again. Like, I appreciate there are people who are interested in it, which is fine. I'm interested in cricket. We're all like weird things. But seriously, I mean, it's been going on for months, and there's nothing else of interest that can possibly be said about these people. So I would be delighted if we could push it into the memory hole now and talk about a lot of other more important things that are going on in the world.
Sam?
Look, I mean, it's no secret I'm a Republican, and I have a great deal of respect for the monarchy, and they're very popular amongst my constituents. I mean, I just, there's that old adage, isn't it? You can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. And never has that been more true than for the royal family. And with every passing day, the more that we hear, the more I feel sorry for them, quite frankly. And I think that,
Sorry for Harry and Meghan, or sorry for the rest of them?
All of them. It must be pretty awful, almost trapped in this gilded cage in this life in which you have to, behind closed doors, they seem to be tearing chunks out of each other. It seems to be pretty awful. And, after, having the Queen, someone who's so respected, who is seen as such a part of the fabric of modern British society, it just seems to be already falling apart at the seams. Everyone's fighting each other within, literally a few months of her passing.
Taffy says on a text, why could you bring yourself to buy that book, Iain? Well, because I feel if I've got to talk about it, and doing this job, you kind of have to. And I know when I go on Good Morning Britain on Friday morning, it'll be the number one subject for discussion. And if you comment on something that you either haven't seen or you haven't read, then people have a go at you for that. So it's my journalistic duty. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it, Vicky Ford.
I just find the whole thing really sad. My dad died in an accident when I was 10. My sister was 12. My brother was 8. Same sort of age as Harry and William, and the impact of that tragedy is the glue that held the three of us together. My brother and my sister are my rocks for each of us, and we are so strong. And to see that those young boys who had that childhood trauma now driven so far apart, I find the whole thing so sad. And like Sam over there, I love cricket, and I
Which
just
is not
don't.
rude at all, Sam.
I don't think it's cricket to say horrible things about people who don't have the right to reply. It's
well, they
just,
do have a right to reply.
I am not buying. I am not. Well, because of their position, they don't. So I'm not buying this book. I find the whole thing really sad. There are plenty of people who've suffered childhood trauma and have come out of it stronger. And we should be looking at ways to help people come out of it stronger, rather than spending all these column inches worrying about Harry's book.
Lionel.
Well, less sad than terrifying is what I read this morning. Says it turns out Harry has a contract for 4 books.
Publishers will be delighted.
Oh, no.
I kind of want to finish the programme now.
Please.
Honestly, I think this story...
And Meghan's got one as well.
Your caller asked whether or not this was a deliberate strategy. No, I don't think the leaking was deliberate. Yes. Did it work out for him? Yes. This is what the biggest lucky break, though, is what it's like now, especially in Britain. It's not that much better in the United States. It's basically so depressing, with the NHS and the strikes and Ukraine. This is light relief. This is something else to talk about that doesn't have that heavy, doom-laden texture. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons it's getting so much attention.
OK. We will move on now from Prince Harry. Now, lots of other subjects you might want to call in about. 0345 6060 973. We've got half an hour to go with our panel of Vicky Ford, Sam Tarry, Lionel Shriver and Sam Freedman. You could ask if we all think cricket is weird. I couldn't believe as a cricket lover you actually used that word, Sam.
Well, I love it. I mean, I just know other people find it as boring as I find the Harry stuff.
There's nothing boring about recent cricket. Really exciting.
Well, what have I started now? It's 8:31. Charlotte Morgan has the news headlines.
With more planned strikes by ambulance staff in England and Wales tomorrow, unions insist workers will always give a safe service. The government's put forward plans for new anti-strike laws for sectors including the NHS to make sure there are minimum levels of staff. The family of a British volunteer in Ukraine say they're very worried and concerned about his welfare. They say Chris Parry, who hasn't made contact since Friday, would not be dissuaded from helping elderly and disabled people in Ukraine. And the publishers of Prince Harry's autobiography say it's become the fastest-selling non-fiction book of all time. 400,000 copies of Spare have been bought since its release at midnight, which they say makes it a runner-up to the Harry Potter novels. LBC weather, rain moving eastwards overnight, scattered showers for Northern Ireland and Western Scotland, and a low of 3 Celsius.
LBC.
Have you
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:35 on LBC. Let me reintroduce my panel to you. Vicky Ford is Conservative MP for Chelmsford, former Foreign Office Minister. Sam Tarry is Labour MP for Ilford South and former Shadow Transport Minister. Lionel Shriver is columnist for Spectator and author. I wanted to say something you were former of, but I couldn't think of anything. You're very current.
I'm very current.
You are, very. And Sam Freedman, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government and a former advisor at the Department of Education. Right, Phil is our next caller in Penrith. Hello, Phil.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. What would you like to ask?
I'd like to ask, would the Nightingale hospitals have been of any use during this present crisis where we're suffering with the NHS?
Well, that's an interesting one. Sam?
This is a really interesting question because one of the problems that we've got is bed capacity, absolutely. We've got by far the fewest number of beds of sort of comparable systems, and that's what's causing the blockage. It's not actually because there's more sick people. It's just because all the beds are full, partly because of we can't get people out into social care, partly because we can't get people home and get support at home. So we definitely don't have enough beds. The question with the Nightingales didn't work during COVID because there was no one to staff them.
And also they weren't needed.
They weren't. They were marginally used. About 300 patients went into them at different points, but they were barely used, and there wasn't sort of. So you can create beds, but you have to staff the beds, and you have to create them sort of management and mechanisms and patient flow. It's very complicated. So it's possible that temporary capacity could be useful, probably on a smaller scale than Nightingale hospitals. But it's not. It might be a very sort of short-term sticking plaster fix, but it's certainly not going to be the long-term fix that we need for this problem.
Tarry.
I mean, I think anything should be tried. The problem is, as Sam has said, it's really about the existing staff. There's been a big debate in the Labour Party about the extent of the private sector involvement in the NHS, etc., etc. Doesn't magically bring about any extra nursing capacity overnight. The problem is that these things have been baked in for such a long period of time. Whether it's enough GPs, I mean, it's something that's in my local inbox all the time, the lack of GPs, the lack of doctors we've got across all of the different health sectors, and of course nurses. We just simply need a lot more people. I think as well, let's be honest and say, Brexit certainly hasn't helped this. We've not really made people who traditionally came to this country to work in the health sector and across the NHS feel welcome, and I think that's been an additional pressure as well. And so, yeah,
there's still a net inflow.
It's not about just the beds. It's about the amount of people that are in the NHS. And at the moment, the problem we've got in terms of retention of NHS staff is massive. The amount of people that have been burnt out over COVID, the amount of people that have got mental health problems, whether it be nurses or doctors or other NHS support staff, is absolutely catastrophic. And so we have really got to, unfortunately, look at this in more of a longer term. There isn't a quick fix. The reality is the King's Fund said that actually the last amount of money the government put in, I think it's about £3 billion, should have been more towards £10 billion. And so actually there needs to be an honest debate about the cost of the NHS and how long it will take to train and to bring in both nurses and doctors. But that has to happen. The sooner we do that, the better.
We had a professor of oncology from St George's Hospital in Tooting on the programme last Thursday. And he was saying that actually it's not money that's the problem. Actually, the more money you throw at the NHS, it tends to disappear into a bottomless pit. That's not the answer, just to say, well, let's have more and more money. And when you think that £1 in every £6 that the government spends is already spent on the NHS, you think, well, what would you like it to be? Two in sort of 6, or there has to be a limit, surely. And if you're going into the next election with a policy of effectively following Tory spending plans like Blair did in 1997, you're not going to get your wish, are you?
Look, I'm not personally signed up to following those spending plans. I think that we need a more serious conversation about progressive taxation in this country, about, closing sort of tax loopholes, about how we honestly fund the NHS, and not just the NHS, extend it into social care. And I think it's about time people start being honest with the British population about what they want, because the danger is people say, well, the alternative is you'll get, private health care insurance. There are very few places in the world where that actually works effectively to support particularly the lower echelons of society. NHS is something that can be saved, and it feels to me that an incoming Labour government will save that. There'll be a debate in our party about how much money we decide to spend on it, but surely we would not be in a situation where for the first time in 106 years the Royal College of Nurses have gone on strike. That would not be happening under a Labour government.
And just very briefly,
it's not as simple saying, do you agree to 19%, 10% or whatever? Clearly the Conservatives are unable to agree because they fear it will happen in other sectors, but it has to happen.
Your constituency neighbour, Wes Streeting, who's Labour Shadow Health Secretary, he's put the cat among the pigeons this week by saying he wants to completely reform the GP services. Now, I'm not sure how he wants to do that, but a lot of people on the left are quite unhappy with him for even floating that possibility.
Look, there needs to be a genuine debate in the party and across the whole of the country about how we reform the NHS. I do agree with you. You can't just chuck more money at it, but it's not either or. There needs to be more money and some reform. It's about how that reform happens. My constituents are furious about the fact they cannot get GP appointments for love nor money. But having said that, it feels that you're picking fights with people like GPs with junior doctors is not necessarily the right way to go about it.
Lionel?
Well, the biggest problem in relation to the so-called bed blockers, it's an unkind term, is in the care sector, which is private. And it's worth remembering that one of the reasons that we have such a shortage of labor in the care sector is not only Brexit, to a degree, yes, but because we sacked so many workers for not getting vaccinated. Now it turns out that vaccination doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you are infected or pass it on, so that was a huge mistake. We never apologize for these mistakes. So that's one of the explanations for what's wrong. The other thing is the trouble with the Nightingale Hospital answer in the short term is that most of these patients want to go home, as we all would. We would want to go home. We wouldn't want to be put in an interim warehouse with a crude partition between beds. It was quite a miracle that they were put up so quickly, but at the same time, it's not where you would want to set up housekeeping for very long. And so that's where the real shortage is in carers, and then, of course, in funding for councils for carers.
Vicky?
So back to Phil's original question, would the Nightingale hospitals work now to help the NHS? And the Nightingale hospitals were very specific, set up en masse to cope with a lot of patients who might have the same condition, all with COVID, all needing ventilators. And actually, it's really good news that they weren't needed because the number of patients, on the whole, they weren't needed because the number of patients with those conditions from COVID came down, the peak of COVID came down, and thank goodness everybody did that lockdown at that time. We can't go back to that. But the question about could we be looking at other areas to increase temporary capacity to help the NHS through this particular situation is absolutely the right one. That's why the Health Secretary came to Parliament yesterday, announced more funding exactly to meet those sorts of temporary capacity issues. That would be partly temporary capacity, unlocking more operating theatres, for example, as well as other beds to help social care, and to help local councils through some of those funding issues that Lionel has mentioned. We do need to make sure that there's also the ability to get people home and the domiciliary care that they need at home, because I agree that a lot of those people, they don't want to stay in a care home, and often if they stay in a care home, it's even longer. Can be more difficult to get them out. And in fact, I was with Essex County Council this morning discussing that exact issue of how do we make sure that we get them back to their homes properly cared for at home. And that was also part of the Secretary of State's comment. As I said earlier, there are more doctors and nurses in the NHS than ever before. There is more money going into the NHS than ever before. There is a need to continue training more NHS staff. Okay. In Chelmsford, we're really lucky. We've got one of the new 10 medical schools that was announced 5 years ago. Our new medical students will be graduating this summer. First time we've ever had doctors trained in Essex. Wonderful to meet them. They're going to be staying in Essex on the whole in the NHS. So putting that investment in to training is really important. And I'm really pleased we've got more people being trained through apprenticeship routes. We're now looking at
why not serve a nurse's bursary? Because that has had a dramatic effect.
Yeah, but that's come back more funding. But actually things like training to be a nurse through the apprenticeship route is increasingly popular as well, because you're earning as well as learning. So looking at these different ways to recruit staff, the associate physician route that I hadn't been aware of.
Surely retaining staff ought to be more of a priority rather than necessarily...
Retaining is important too.
But so many are leaving, aren't they?
Yes, but as I said, there are actually record numbers, but you've got to look at the demand.
There's record demand.
Pandemic, the fact that people have got now often multiple conditions, so more severe conditions, making more difficult to treat. It's also finding out how you can get extra capacity that's not just bed capacity, but for example, looking at how pharmacists could be able to help more with conditions. And those were all part of the Secretary of State's statement yesterday.
I just want to pick up on something that you said there, because several listeners are picking up on this. Lionel Robin says, you can't let Lionel Shriver go unchallenged to say that vaccinations did not have any kind of benefits or any effect on infection or transmission of COVID. Do you want to just clarify what you meant?
The vaccines were never even tested for whether or not they affected transmission or infection. So we were...
What were they about then?
Well, we were told up front that they were going to keep us from getting COVID, and then they changed their line, and it was, okay, well, you can still get infected and you can still give it to other people. The point was
you were less likely to be infected.
Keep you out of hospital, and you won't die. And now the figures are even looking very dodgy for that. So I do think the vaccines saved a considerable number of largely older people during the first couple of waves of much more dangerous versions of COVID, and those are the people who probably should have exclusively got them, because the benefits wane very quickly after about 3 months. They're not nearly as effective as they used to be. And for most of us, under 60 at least, that we could probably have done without it.
Well, I totally disagree with
everyone
that.
As an NHS doctor's wife, when he went back into scrubs to go and help on the wards, I cannot tell you how terrifying it was to be a family member of an NHS doctor or NHS staff when they were going into those wards. The day he got the vaccine, I knelt and cried for joy, because you knew that it was going to reduce the chances of those NHS staff from dying from COVID, and many of them did. And the vaccine has helped to save many, many lives, not just of older people, but of those others who went to work in the NHS at that time. And so I absolutely support the vaccine wholeheartedly with every single bit of my body, because it saved and protected so many lives.
Do you think that we should have sacked care workers for not getting vaccinated?
I think it was really, really important that we tried to keep, having learned what we learned from the first wave about the danger of COVID in care homes, to try and reduce transmission in care homes. And the vaccine seemed at the time
doesn't reduce transmission.
Seemed at the time to be reducing the probability that you were going to get COVID. And that's a difficult decision. People were making a lot of difficult decisions at that time, but we needed to try and protect those who were most vulnerable.
Corey, my producer, says, as interesting as this is, we may need to go to a break soon, because we are 5 minutes overdue for once, but very interesting discussion. I always obey Corey, usually anyway. 8:49.
LBC.
How many
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:52. Vicky Ford, Sam Tarry, Lionel Shriver and Sam Freedman with us answering your questions. And this is a text question from Lorraine in Worcester. Does Boris Johnson being airbrushed out of a photo posted online by Grant Shapps show his political career is all over now? Well, you're reading in a lot into something there. Who should we go to first, Vicky?
I'm just absolutely gobsmacked about how that happened. I mean,
Grant Shapps was always a sort of real defender of Boris Johnson, wasn't he? Why would he do it?
I just can't get my head around how the wrong photo was clearly put there. I mean, it's just weird.
Presumably it wasn't a wrong photo, it was an airbrushed photo that someone decided to...
Who decided? I mean, the whole thing is just, like, what? Was my reaction, the reaction of other... What? Anyway, it's just...
Because the thing is, if you airbrush someone out of a photo, someone out there will know. They will have seen the original, and you'll be found out. So
yeah, exactly. And you know, Grant, as you say, has always got on really well with Boris. I can't see it. I can't understand it. Actually, do you know what? I think this is a photograph at the spaceport, right? That is really sad that we didn't manage to get that space launch off successfully, actually, because satellite industry is really important to the country. So I hope that gets rectified pretty quickly.
What about Boris Johnson's
I hope
future?
that whoever airbrushed that picture is really regretting.
Well, I mean, Grant Shapps, shall we say, has a bit of history on this front, doesn't he? I mean, at least there weren't two Grant Shappses in the photo.
That comment has been made.
But what about Boris Johnson's future? I don't know sort of how close you were to him, whether you were a great supporter of his, but he clearly does hanker after a comeback at some point, doesn't he?
You know, Boris has got huge energy. He was in the House of Commons yesterday asking questions. He's clearly still committed to being around in Parliament. And, you know, he's still active in politics. So... You know, why would you airbrush somebody out of a photograph?
No, we've moved on from that. Would you welcome a Boris Johnson return at some point?
I think everybody in the party is just really, really happy that we are stable, that we are focused on big issues like getting the economy back on track, dealing with inflation, dealing with those NHS backlogs that we've been talking about, sorting out the small boats issues. That is what the Prime Minister, Rishi, has said are our priorities, and we just need to get on and deliver it.
Sam Freedman, your old boss, Michael Gove, he's had more comebacks than Tom Jones. Do you think that there's a Boris Johnson comeback on the horizon?
I'm sure he would like to. I mean, you know, he is at heart an attention seeker and would very much... I'm sure he's loving the amount of articles being written about whether there'll be a Boris Johnson comeback or not at the moment. I mean, the chances of it, certainly pre-election, are minute because, as Vicky says, the Conservative Party are... briefly at least stable, and the last thing they want to encourage is another leadership election, another leadership fight. So apart from a few die-hard fans, I think there's not a lot of demand for a comeback, certainly pre-election.
Lionel.
Of course, there's the question of will he, and then there's the question of should he. If I were he, I'd certainly give it a long breather. After all, right now, he can make a fortune on the lecture circuit. And I think he's happy in that circumstance. He likes to perform. He likes, you know, verbal wordplay, and I've never got the impression that he especially enjoyed the nitty-gritty of governing. I think that's one of the things that he does have in common with Donald Trump.
Well, I've always thought he would be happier as next Prime Minister than he was as Prime Minister.
Well, then he could be a bunny in a briar patch.
A what?
A bunny in a briar patch.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Is that an American expression? I've never heard that one.
Must be. I've never had anyone look at me with such
bafflement. Does that mean really, really happy?
I think what you mean is like a pig in the proverbial.
Yes. I was deliberately editing that one out.
Sam Tarry.
I mean, it's a bit Stalinist to airbrush someone. Perhaps, though, just by deleting someone from a photo, I don't think the British public at the next election are going to forget the many crimes of Boris Johnson. I mean, I just almost see it as a metaphor, really, for the current government, for the Tory party, the state that they're in, the state the country's in. It's kind of like you can airbrush something, pretend the past hasn't happened. It's like blaming COVID for the state of the NHS. Of course, it's a factor, but 10 years of austerity, 10 years of economic mismanagement, one of the longest periods without any serious growth in the economy, lack of industrial strategy. You can't airbrush those things away, unfortunately. So I see it as a metaphor for their impending demise.
Talking of political comebacks, are you going to have a political comeback? Because, of course, you've been deselected in your constituency, quite controversially, some would say. I think you've said it yourself. What's your future?
I'm fully intending to stand as a Labour MP at the next election.
But in a different constituency, presumably.
At the moment, I can't really comment on that because it's an ongoing internal discussion with the Labour Party. But put it this way, that was an election in which perhaps you might say it wasn't the votes that counted, but who counted the votes that mattered.
I could go on in that, but I think I'll leave that there because lawyers might be listening. You never know. Final question from Danny in Ipswich. He says, Matt Hancock says he wasn't buying a hair transplant and veneers during his market browsing in Istanbul, despite the rumours online. What should he have spent his cash on there instead? Sam Freedman. Why is it going to? I mean, it's a strange place to go to when Parliament's sitting. Not quite as strange as the Australian jungle, maybe.
I mean, if there's one person I'm less interested in than Harry, it might be Matt Hancock. I think if there's anyone who's suffered from overexposure in the last few months, it is the former health minister.
Vicky Ford.
Well, what should he spend his money on? I think not Harry's book.
Sam?
Definitely not spending on Harry's book. No way.
Maybe a return ticket so he can actually do his job in Parliament might be a good idea.
Yeah.
He said controversially. Lionel?
He can buy my last book. It's cheaper than 28 quid.
And what's it called?
Abominations, Selected Essays from a Career of Courting Self-Destruction.
Well, there we go.
I think you should give us all a signed version of that. Thank you all very
much indeed. Vicky Ford, Sam Tarry, Lionel Shriver and Sam Freedman. Don't forget, if you ever miss an episode of Cross Question, you can catch up on Global Player. In a moment, we are going to turn our attention to one of my favourite subjects, the future of electric cars. Because last year, fewer electric cars were manufactured than the previous year, which might seem counterintuitive when you think, well, in 2030, everybody's got to have it, or you won't be able to buy a diesel or a petrol car. I want to know what your experience of electric cars has been. Good and bad. 0345 6060 973. We're going to be talking to two people who are very pro-electric car. And as you might have gathered by now, I'm kind of on the other side through personal experience. So, but I'm more interested in your experiences than mine. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the business secretary has angered unions by claiming tomorrow's ambulance strike is putting lives at risk. Grant Shapps was speaking in the Commons as he outlined plans to introduce minimum service requirements for some public sector roles, which he says will make the UK safer. But Labour MP and former Shadow Transport Minister Sam Parry has told LBC's Cross Question the government is sidestepping the problem.
This, for me, is absolutely about creating a bogeyman for the government to attack.